"Go to the hall, you disgraceful woman," the cafe owner barked, and was stunned when all the rich people applauded the dishwasher. Emily Carter had always lived a life that hovered between invisibility and resilience. Born and raised in the modest outskirts of San Francisco, she was no stranger to hard work. Her days began before the sun rose and often ended long after the city had fallen asleep. At only 22 years old, Emily carried responsibilities that would crush most people her age. Her mother, once a lively piano teacher, had been bedridden for years due to a degenerative illness. Her younger brother, Noah, was just 14 and depended entirely on her both as a sister and a parental figure. The tiny two-bedroom apartment they called home was cramped, but full of love. Photos of better days lined the cracked walls, images of family picnics, school plays, and birthdays where their father had once stood proudly by their side. But since his sudden passing 5 years ago in a construction accident, the Carter family's world had shrunk dramatically. Gone were the simple luxuries, no more piano lessons for the mother, no more after-school activities for Noah, and certainly no college for Emily, at least not yet. Emily worked at the Golden Spoon Cafe, one of San Francisco's most prestigious coffee shops located in the heart of the financial district, a place where hedge fund managers, startup founders, and tech moguls sipped imported coffees while discussing millions and billions as casually as others discussed the weather. To the clientele, Emily was invisible. She wasn't a waitress with a name tag, nor a barista crafting delicate lattes. She was the dishwasher, tucked away behind the swinging kitchen doors, her hands submerged in endless sinks of hot, soapy water. Her manager and owner of the cafe, Mr. Gregory Benson, was a man whose outer polish barely concealed a cruel core. He prided himself on running a tight ship, no nonsense, no mistakes, and certainly no tolerance for what he often called staff stepping out of line. His disdain for anyone he deemed beneath the clientele was palpable, though his smile dazzled the customers. His glares and gritted teeth were reserved for the staff behind the scenes. Emily had become proficient at disappearing. She had mastered the art of moving through the narrow kitchen corridors without attracting attention. Her existence was a rhythm of clanking dishes, swirling water, and the occasional bark from Gregory or the head chef. Despite it all, Emily never complained. She carried herself with quiet dignity, knowing that each paycheck was a lifeline keeping her family afloat. But there were dreams, quiet, persistent dreams that refused to be washed away. Late at night, after Noah had gone to sleep and her mother was resting, Emily would pull out an old worn notebook. In it, she scribbled business ideas, marketing plans, and reflections on how she would one day open her own cafe. Her passion wasn't just about coffee or pastries, it was about creating a space where everyone, regardless of their background, felt valued. Her life was a balancing act between duty and hope. On most days, the weight of responsibility overshadowed her aspirations. Still, Emily found solace in small things. The warmth of the sun filtering through their cracked kitchen window in the morning, the rare laugh from her mother when Noah told a silly joke, or the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, no matter how invisible the world tried to make her, she mattered to the two people who loved her most. Friday mornings were usually predictable, but this particular Friday was different. From the moment Emily stepped into the cafe's back entrance, she sensed the tension in the air. The kitchen was unusually spotless. The silverware gleamed unnaturally bright, and even Gregory's voice seemed more clipped and strained than usual. She overheard snippets of conversation between the waitstaff. "Big reservation today. Did you see the list of names? It's... wow. Silicon Valley royalty, basically." Emily frowned but continued her routine. Tie her apron, roll up her sleeves, and prepare for another day of invisible labor. Still, there was a peculiar buzz in the air. Something was about to happen, something that would ripple far beyond the confines of the Golden Spoon Cafe. And Emily, the dishwasher nobody noticed, was unknowingly standing at the very edge of a moment that would change her life forever. The air inside the Golden Spoon Cafe was heavier than usual, laced with the tension of perfectionism that only surfaced on days like this. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall, spotless windows, glinting off the polished brass fixtures and pristine marble countertops. Everything had been scrubbed twice, rearranged 3 times, and inspected, no less than a dozen times by Mr. Gregory himself. His normally sharp eyes had become even more hawk-like, scrutinizing every surface, every corner, every breath his employees dared to take. Emily felt it the moment she walked past the kitchen into the dish station. There was no usual chatter among the servers, no laughter from the baristas preparing their syrups and foamed milk. Instead, whispers filled the air like static. Waiters glanced nervously at their watches. The head chef, usually a gruff but predictable presence, barked orders with an edge of panic. Even the sous chef, who normally hummed classical music while preparing sauces, stood tensely at his station, double-checking everything from garnish to grill marks. It did not take long for Emily to overhear why. A private brunch had been booked under the name of Richard Evans. That name alone sent a ripple through the staff like a thunderclap. Richard Evans, the tech magnate behind one of the most successful startups in Silicon Valley, was not just rich, he was stratospherically wealthy. Alongside him were scheduled to arrive some of the most influential venture capitalists, CEOs, and investors in the entire region. This was not just a brunch, this was an event that could determine the cafe's future in the elite dining scene of San Francisco. Gregory, dressed in his most expensive tailored suit, paced the floor like a general preparing for battle. His shoes clicked against the hardwood with military precision. Every time he passed an employee, his gaze narrowed, scanning for flaws. A single fingerprint on the silverware, a coffee cup placed a millimeter off-center, a crumb on the polished floor. Each of these was treated like a cardinal sin. His voice was sharp and merciless. "No mistakes today," he growled. "None, you hear me? These are not ordinary customers. They are the kind of people who make or break reputations. I will not tolerate incompetence. Not today, not ever." The staff responded in robotic unison, each nodding quickly, murmuring, "Yes, sir," like a chant of survival. Emily, though tucked away from the dining area, felt the pressure as acutely as anyone. Dish piles were expected to be cleared faster, spotless faster, returned to the shelves faster. The pace doubled, then tripled. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, scrubbing plates, rinsing silverware, drying glasses that seemed to appear endlessly, even before the main guests had arrived. By mid-morning, the cafe's private dining hall was transformed. White linen tablecloths stretched taut across every table. Centerpieces of fresh orchids had been specially ordered for the occasion. Waiters rehearsed their tray balances, repeating the precise phrasing of the specials and how to pronounce obscure items on the imported wine list. Then, right on schedule, the procession began. Sleek black cars pulled up in front of the cafe, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. One by one, the titans of industry stepped out. Men and women in perfectly tailored suits, shoes that gleamed like mirrors, watches worth more than most people's homes. They carried themselves with the effortless confidence of those who commanded entire markets with a single decision. Gregory personally greeted each one at the door, his smile wide but strained, his hands ringing nervously behind his back after each handshake. "Mr. Evans, welcome. A pleasure, truly. This way, please. Your table is prepared," he purred, leading them toward the private section. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere shifted from mere tension to suffocating anxiety. Orders began to fly in, complicated, customized, and meticulously detailed. The chef scrambled to execute everything flawlessly. A steak seared exactly medium rare, eggs poached to silky perfection, an almond croissant that had to be heated to precisely the right temperature. No more, no less. Emily moved faster than ever, barely registering her own exhaustion. Her hands, raw from the constant immersion in hot water and detergent, trembled slightly, but there was no room for rest. Each cleared plate came back coated with sauces, crumbs, and remnants of gourmet, meals that had to be vanished within seconds. Her focus was absolute until, suddenly, the sharp sound of breaking glass split the air. Not from the kitchen, not from the dish station, but from the dining hall itself. Time seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Heads whipped around toward the sauce. Emily instinctively turned her head even though her job kept her behind the scenes. A waiter, David, one of the newer hires, had tripped over the edge of a chair that had been slightly out of place. In his hands had been a large silver tray, carefully balanced with 6 crystal champagne flutes and a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. Now the tray lay sideways, the flutes shattered across the hardwood floor, fragments scattering like tiny diamonds under the glaring sunlight. Gasps echoed from the high-ceilinged room. Conversation halted instantly. Even the most composed billionaires turned their eyes toward the scene, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disapproval. David stood frozen, his face pale as milk, his hands still outstretched as if trying to catch what was already lost. Gregory was there in seconds, his face, red as fire, twisted into a mask of rage. "You incompetent fool!" he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the marble and wood like a gunshot. "What did I tell you? What did I tell all of you?" Emily's instincts overtook her hesitation. Without thinking, she dropped the towel she was holding and rushed out from the kitchen into the hall. Her eyes scanned the floor, checking for anyone who might step on the shards. A piece glinted dangerously close to the polished shoe of one of the investors. She crouched quickly, scooping up the larger fragments with her bare hands, careful but swift. Her presence in the hall, however, did not go unnoticed. Gregory whipped around, his eyes landing on her as though she had just committed an unforgivable crime. His face contorted with a sneer of pure disdain. "You, what are you doing out here? Get back to the kitchen." His voice rose, sharp and cruel. Then louder, for everyone to hear, he barked the words that would hang in the air like smoke. "Go to the hall, you disgraceful woman." The words echoed, harsh and humiliating. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. The elite guests, the powerful, the untouchable, sat watching, their expressions unreadable. Emily froze, her hands full of glass, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The world seemed to shrink in that moment. Her hands trembled. Her ears rang with the deafening silence. Shame surged through her, burning her, cheeks twisting her stomach into knots. She lowered her gaze, ready to stand and flee, to vanish into the kitchen, into the safety of invisibility like she always did. But something else was about to happen, something no one, least of all Gregory, could have ever expected. The silence that wrapped the cafe after Gregory's words was suffocating, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. Emily remained crouched, her hands trembling, still gathering pieces of broken crystal. Her eyes stared at the ground, not daring to meet the gaze of anyone present, though she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes pinned to her like needles. Her heart pounded so violently against her ribs that it nearly drowned out every other sound. A sharp, unexpected noise cut through the oppressive silence, a slow, deliberate clap. One pair of hands, clapping in measured rhythm, not mocking, not sarcastic. A genuine, almost defiant applause. Heads snapped toward the source. Emily's eyes, drawn by reflex more than courage, followed suit. It was Richard Evans. The billionaire sat back slightly in his chair, his tailored navy suit crisp against the pristine white of the tablecloth, his expression unreadable, but his posture utterly self-assured. His hands continued clapping, a sound that seemed to grow louder and louder against the stunned quiet of the room. 1, 2, 3 deliberate claps, then a fourth, a fifth. For a moment, no one joined him. Shock paralyzed everyone, from the waitstaff to the most composed investors. Gregory blinked as though he had been slapped, his mouth slightly ajar but unable to form words. Then from the other end of the table, another figure, an older woman with silver hair styled in a sharp bob, dressed in a sleek black pantsuit, began to clap as well. Her name was Victoria Lee, a legendary venture capitalist whose mere presence could shift entire markets. Her applause was just as purposeful, just as loud. A third joined, then a fourth. Within seconds, nearly the entire table of billionaires and executives was applauding, not for the cafe, not for Gregory's flawless decor, but for Emily, the dishwasher. The woman crouched on the floor, picking up broken glass with bare hands. The rhythm swelled into a wave of clapping that filled the hall. Waitstaff stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths agape. The few remaining customers who were not part of the private event watched in confusion, some looking between Gregory and the applauding executives, as if waiting for an explanation for this surreal turn of events. Emily could hardly breathe. Her brain struggled to process what was happening. She stood slowly, instinctively brushing her hands on her apron, not realizing a small cut on her palm had begun to bleed. Her breath hitched as she cautiously looked toward Richard Evans, who had now risen to his feet. His voice carried easily, clear, confident, and steady, the kind of voice that had undoubtedly commanded boardrooms and international conferences. "What's your name?" he asked, directing the question to Emily, ignoring Gregory completely. Emily hesitated, swallowing hard. Her voice was small but audible. Emily Carter." Richard nodded once, then turned toward the table, addressing everyone in the room, his words deliberate. "Emily Carter. Let me tell you something about people like Emily." He stepped forward, hands clasped lightly behind his back. His gaze swept the room. "I started exactly like her. 20 years ago, I was washing dishes at a roadside diner in Oakland. My family had nothing, no safety net, no connections. My first lesson in business wasn't from Stanford or Harvard. It was from scrubbing burnt eggs off plates, sweeping floors, and understanding that no job is beneath anyone willing to work." The room was utterly silent, except for the occasional snap of phone cameras capturing this unexpected speech. "I have seen a lot of things in my career," Richard continued, his eyes landing squarely on Gregory now. "But what I cannot stand, what I will never tolerate, is arrogance disguised as leadership, especially when it targets the very people whose labor keeps businesses like this one running." Gregory, who had been rigid with anger moments before, now stood pale, his mouth opening and closing uselessly, like a fish stranded on dry land. His hands wrung together nervously behind his back, but no words came. Richard turned back to Emily. "You, young lady, showed more dignity, more courage, and more professionalism in the last 2 minutes than some people do in their entire careers." His eyes flicked briefly back to Gregory, leaving no doubt about whom he meant. Victoria stepped in then, rising smoothly from her seat. "He's right. I started my career cleaning offices at night while studying during the day. People forget where they came from, but we don't. Not all of us." Another guest stood, followed by another. Soon, a dozen of the most powerful people in the room were on their feet, offering not just applause but genuine expressions of respect. Some nodded toward Emily, some murmured her name. Others simply clapped, louder now, as if willing the walls to absorb this shift in power, this sudden and irreversible redirection of attention. Emily stood frozen, her throat tight, unsure whether to cry, run, or collapse. Never in her life had anyone, much less a titan like Richard Evans, acknowledged her existence like this, much less praised it. Gregory, realizing the tide had turned violently against him, attempted to salvage his position. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, forcing a smile that was more grimace than grace. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there has been some misunderstanding," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "No misunderstanding at all," Richard interrupted sharply, his tone colder now, heard exactly what happened. "We all saw," and Gregory faltered. His smile vanished. His eyes darted toward the waitstaff, perhaps hoping for some silent ally, but found none. Every employee stood motionless, too stunned or too fearful to intervene. The tension thickened as Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that it carried like a blade. "This is not how you treat people, not here, not anywhere." For a long moment, no one spoke. Emily remained at the center of this storm of shifting power dynamics, her heart still thundering, her hands shaking, even as she tried to hold them steady by clasping them together. Then, as if some invisible signal had passed through the room, the clapping slowed, then stopped, but the respect remained suspended in the air like static. Richard turned once more toward Emily and offered a simple, grounding smile. "Wrong. Nothing at all. You did nothing." The moment stretched, thick with meaning, as Emily slowly realized that something in her life had fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The atmosphere inside the Golden Spoon Cafe was now thick with tension, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were struggling to hold the weight of what had just occurred. Gregory stood rooted in place, his face drained of its usual arrogance, shifting between an ashen pallor and a blotchy red that betrayed his panic. For the first time since the cafe's grand opening, he found himself utterly powerless, stripped of the performative authority that his tailored suits and sharp tongue usually afforded him. Emily remained frozen where she stood, her mind spinning, her heartbeat hammering so loudly that it felt as though the sound reverberated through her entire body. She had not chosen to become the center of this attention. Her only intention had been to prevent someone from stepping on the shards of broken crystal, and yet here she was, caught between humiliation and unexpected vindication, her hands still faintly trembling, her breathing shallow and rapid. Gregory's eyes darted around the room, seeking someone, anyone, to redirect the collapsing narrative in his favor. But every pair of eyes in the room, whether belonging to a billionaire, a server, or a customer in the far corner, was locked firmly on him, heavy with expectation, judgment, and something else far worse for a man like him, disappointment. He straightened his spine, adjusted his silk tie, and stepped forward, forcing a brittle smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice lacking the usual steel, I must apologize for this disruption. The standards of the Golden Spoon have always been—" "Spare us the rehearsed speech," Richard Evans cut in, his voice crisp, leaving no room for rebuttal. His posture radiated effortless command, the kind born not from arrogance but from a lifetime of proving people wrong. "We are not here for you. We are here despite you." The words hit Gregory like a slap. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He blinked rapidly, trying to recalibrate, but the more he stood there floundering, the more obvious it became. To everyone that the curtain had been pulled back on the facade he had so carefully crafted over the years. Victoria Lee, still standing beside Richard, crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly. "You should be thanking Emily for preventing someone from getting hurt," she said, her tone sharp as glass. "Instead, you chose to humiliate her. Publicly, loudly, and for what? For doing something you should have done yourself." A few murmurs rippled through the seated guests, quiet but unmistakable. Nods, raised eyebrows, small gestures of agreement spreading through the room like a subtle contagion of disapproval. Gregory's gaze snapped toward Emily, and for a brief, ugly second, his mask cracked fully. His eyes burned with a venomous mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something far pettier, resentment. Not just because she had interrupted the service, not just because she had dared to cross the invisible line between kitchen and hall, but because, in this moment, she was no longer beneath him. "You," Gregory snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Emily as though she were the root of all his misfortunes. His voice trembled, but the volume rose, desperation bleeding through every syllable. "You are a dishwasher. You do not belong out here. You belong in the back, where no one has to see you." Gasps rose from several corners of the room. Even the employees who had grown numb to Gregory's daily tirades behind closed doors stood shocked by the sheer audacity of his public degradation. No amount of carefully polished branding could scrub the ugliness of those words from the hair. Gregory, breathing heavily now, stepped closer, gesturing wildly toward the kitchen. "Back to where you belong. The hall is no place for people like you. Know your place. Go back." For a split second, the world narrowed around Emily. Her vision tunneled. The sounds in the room warped, slowing into muffled echoes. The sting of those words pierced deeper than any insult before. They were not just words hurled in anger. They were an attempt to erase her, to shove her back into the invisible margins where people like Gregory believed she belonged. But something inside her, something that had been forged from years of hardship, of carrying her family, of enduring without breaking, snapped, not in defeat, not in collapse, but in resistance. Before she could speak, however, a sharp voice rose above Gregory's ranting. "Enough!" It was Richard again, but this time his tone carried the weight of finality, as though he were closing a deal, ending negotiations, drawing a line in the sand. Not one more word. His hand lifted, palm outward, commanding silence. Gregory flinched, his mouth clamping shut as if an invisible force had snapped it closed. "For you are not just disrespecting this young woman," Richard continued, his gaze turning icy. You are disrespecting every single person who has ever worked a job like hers, every person who has ever scrubbed floors, washed dishes, or taken a job beneath their potential just to survive. You're disrespecting me. You're disrespecting Victoria. You're disrespecting every person in this room who remembers what it's like to start at the bottom. A beat passed, then another. Gregory stood trembling, his hands clenched at his sides, lips pressed into a thin white line. Victoria's voice joined, colder than steel, narrowing. It's you. The real disgrace here isn't Emily, she said, her eyes another murmur swept through the guests. This time it was not just whispers. Several executives leaned toward one another, shaking their heads, muttering words like unacceptable, appalling, and unprofessional. The head waiter, a middle-aged man named Samuel, who had worked at the cafe for more than 15 years, stepped forward. His face bore the weight of years of suppressed frustration. For the first time in his career, he no longer wore the guarded expression of a subordinate under tyrannical management. Instead, his eyes were clear, his jaw set. Emily did the right thing, he said firmly, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. If anyone's out of place here, it's not her. A surge of quiet agreement spread among the staff. The baristas behind the counter exchanged glances. The servers who had spent years enduring Gregory's cruelty straightened their shoulders a little. The sous chef, visible through the open kitchen window, nodded solemnly. Emily stood in the center of it all, her breath catching, her hands slowly unclenching. Something heavy, something that had sat on her chest for years, seemed to loosen. She realized with startling clarity that the shame Gregory had tried to weaponize against her no longer belonged to her. It never had. Richard stepped forward one more time, glancing at Emily with a reassuring nod before turning to Gregory with the final blow. This, he said, gesturing around the room, this will be remembered by every person here, by every person who sees the video. Gregory blinked in confusion. What video? Dozens of smartphones were pointed in his direction. Customers, guests, even one or two of his own staff, all recording, capturing every cruel word, every insult, every moment of this spectacle. Panic visibly rippled across Gregory's face. His hands trembled as he stared into the cold, unblinking eyes of 100 phone cameras. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Only a desperate, pitiful rasp as the realization crashed down on him. The damage was already done. The entire cafe stood suspended in a stillness so profound it felt as though time itself had fractured. The delicate hum of conversation, the rhythmic clinking of cutlery, the soft hiss of steaming milk, all the typical background noises of a busy cafe had evaporated into a hollow void. Even the ever-present urban soundscape of San Francisco outside seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp weight of collective disbelief. Emily remained standing at the center of it all, her hands unconsciously clutched at her apron, the sting of a shallow cut on her palm barely registering beneath the tidal wave of adrenaline flooding her body. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. The sting of humiliation still burned on her skin, but something else now mixed with it. An unfamiliar, almost foreign sensation. Not pride, not yet, but something dangerously close to it. Something that whispered she did not deserve the role Gregory had tried to force upon her. Gregory stood frozen, his rigid frame a picture of collapsing power. His mouth twitched, opened, then shut. His hands, usually animated with gestures of condescension, now trembled at his sides. His eyes darted wildly, not in defiance, but in pure, naked panic. Each direction he turned, he was met not with sympathy, not with understanding, but with the cold, judgmental glare of dozens of eyes, wealthy patrons, elite investors, seasoned professionals, and even his own employees, all united in their silent, overwhelming disapproval. No one came to his rescue. Victoria Lee's gaze was piercing, her arms crossed with the kind of authority that required no words. Richard Evans remained standing, watching Gregory with the detached curiosity one might reserve for a malfunctioning machine, an object no longer serving its purpose, bound for disposal. Other members of the table shifted in their seats, some leaning back, some leaning forward, but none removing their attention from the unfolding spectacle. Phones remained raised, silent witnesses, unforgiving recorders. Some were already broadcasting the scene live, others quietly documented, their owners knowing full well that what was happening here was no longer a private affair. It was a moment destined to escape these walls, to ignite conversations far beyond the polished marble floors of the Golden Spoon. A soft scrape echoed as someone pushed back a chair. A tall man, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a charcoal suit and Oxford shoes so polished they mirrored the chandelier light, stood slowly. His name was Samuel Park, a venture capitalist known for his ruthless acumen and equally ruthless honesty. His voice broke the silence, smooth but firm. "I have seen a lot of embarrassing things in my life, but this," he gestured loosely toward Gregory, shaking his head, "this is exceptional." A ripple of subdued laughter, not joyful but disbelieving, spread among the seated guests. It was the sound of powerful people witnessing something so far, beneath their standards, that it ceased being offensive and instead became tragically absurd. Gregory flinched, his lips curling into a defensive sneer. "This is being blown out of proportion," he snapped, his voice brittle. "You do not understand the dynamics of running a business. Employees must be respected." Richard interrupted, voice like ice cracking under pressure. "Business. Or there is no." Another chair scraped back. A woman with auburn hair twisted into a precise bun rose gracefully, her emerald dress swaying as she stood. Her name was Lydia Benson, no relation to Gregory, a major angel investor whose portfolio spanned from biotech to AI startups. Her expression was cool, but laced with controlled fury. "Do you realize," she said slowly, her tone sharpened to a razor's edge, "that the only disgrace anyone has witnessed today is you?" Gregory stumbled back half a step, as though her words had been a physical blow. His hands flew up in a half-hearted gesture of defense. This is my establishment," he hissed, voice cracking. "I will not be disrespected. In my own cafe." "No," Victoria countered instantly, her tone now deadly calm. "Thoroughly, publicly. You have disrespected yourself." The weight of her words crashed over the room like a wave. Even the servers who had been paralyzed at the edges of the scene began to shift, shoulders straightened, backs unbent. The head waiter, Samuel, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of looking invisible, now stood fully upright, arms crossed, his normally downcast eyes glaring directly at Gregory with something close to contempt. And then, in an act that shifted the energy yet again, Richard turned away from Gregory completely, as though dismissing him not just from the conversation, but from significance itself. He faced Emily directly. "Emily," he said, lowering his voice, gentler now but still firm enough that every person present strained to hear. "How long have you worked here?" Emily blinked, startled by the sudden shift, but grateful for it. Her voice caught in her throat, but she managed to force it out. 3 years, a few murmurs, some of surprise, some of disbelief. 3 years, Richard repeated, letting the number hang. "Years, has anyone—" His eyes flicked briefly toward Gregory. "Work? 3 years, and in those 3, ever thanked you for your..." Emily's lips parted. She faltered. Her mind raced through every exhausting double shift, every burn from scalding water, every slammed plate and impatient demand. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carried clearly in the hush that blanketed the room. "No, no one has." A long silence followed. The weight of her words settled like dust on polished glass. It was a truth too raw to be debated. Richard nodded once. "Well," he said, his voice steady, "let's start now." He began to clap. Not the slow, dramatic clap of mockery, not the hesitant, unsure applause of confused observers. This was deliberate, firm, respectful, a recognition, not a performance. One by one, others joined. Victoria, Lydia, Samuel, more and more. A cascade of applause rolled through the hall, not thunderous but steady, intentional. Even the staff, hesitant at first, glanced at one another and began to clap. Some softly, some with a strength that spoke of years of suppressed frustration, finally given permission to breathe. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, her mouth open in disbelief. Her eyes burned, but she held back the tears, not wanting to collapse under the weight of this impossible moment. Gregory did not clap. He stood rigid, his arms stiff at his sides, his face locked in a contorted mask of rage and disbelief. His breathing was shallow, erratic, his composure shredded. He glanced toward the kitchen, as though seeking refuge, then toward the front doors, as though considering fleeing. But there was no escape. Not from this, not anymore. The applause continued, growing only slightly louder but never breaking into chaos. It remained dignified, controlled, an undeniable, unanimous statement. Emily, the dishwasher, the woman he had just called disgraceful, was now the most respected person in the room. The sound of applause lingered like a cleansing wind, clearing away the suffocating remnants of Gregory's cruelty. It was not just noise, it was an act of defiance against everything he represented. For years, Gregory had maintained an ecosystem of fear, operating behind a veneer of sophistication, while exploiting the invisible labor of people like Emily. But now that system was unraveling, not in private, not behind closed doors, but in front of the most influential people in the city. Emily stood in the middle of it all, her breathing shallow, her vision wavering between the sharp clarity of disbelief and the blurry threat of tears she refused to let fall. Her hands, stained with water, detergent, and a trace of blood from the glass hung stiffly at her sides. She had never been the center of anyone's attention before. Not like this. Not for something good. Her instinct told her to retreat, to fold into herself, to disappear back into the kitchen, into the world where she had always been unseen. But no one was letting her fade away this time. Richard Evans took another step forward, closing the queue, distance between them. His posture was confident but never imposing. His hands rested comfortably in his pockets as he studied her, his expression shifting from the commanding presence of a billionaire investor to something softer, more human. There was a familiarity in his gaze, as if he saw not just Emily, but a version of himself reflected in her. "You remind me of someone," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear but directed entirely at her. "Someone I knew a long time ago. A kid who scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and dreamed of one day doing more than just survive." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat tightened, constricting around whatever response might have existed. Richard continued, his eyes scanning the room now. "It's easy to forget," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner, "that every single one of us started somewhere. Some of us had families with connections, some had trust funds, but some," his eyes returned to Emily, "started with nothing but determination and the refusal to stay invisible." A murmur spread through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Heads nodded, arms crossed, loosened. Even those accustomed to the sterile detachment of corporate boardrooms felt the truth vibrating in the air. "I was 17, Richard said, shifting his weight slightly. "Dropped out of high school. My father left. My mother worked 3 jobs. I washed dishes in a greasy diner off Mission Street. The manager treated us like we were disposable, like we were replaceable. Sound familiar?" Emily swallowed hard, nodding once, unable to speak. "I remember thinking," Richard went on, "that this wasn't going to be my whole life. But I also remember realizing that it wasn't shameful to be where I was. Shame didn't belong to me. It belonged to the people who thought they were better than me, just because I wore an apron and had soap under my fingernails." His voice sharpened as he turned back to the table of elites. "We've all been guilty of forgetting, of pretending. The hands that clean our tables, refill our coffee, and wash our dishes are somehow lesser. But they are not. They are the foundation. Without them, there is nothing. No service, no business, no success." A wave of silence followed his words. Not the oppressive kind that had followed Gregory's insults, but a reflective silence, one filled with thought, introspection, and, for some, discomfort. Victoria uncrossed her arms and spoke next, her tone firm but rich with resonance. "When I worked overnight shifts cleaning office buildings while attending community college during the day. People used to look right through me, pretend I wasn't there. I learned then that the hardest working people in the room are usually the most ignored. She gestured toward Emily. But today, we are not ignoring you. We see you. Samuel. Park nodded in agreement, cutting a sharp glance toward Gregory. Hard work isn't disgraceful. What's disgraceful, he added, is treating people as if they are. Emily's throat constricted, but something shifted in her posture. Her shoulders, once hunched from years of trying to take up less space, straightened, tentatively. At first, then, with more certainty. Her chin lifted, her fingers uncurled. The tremor in her hand subsided just enough to form a fist at her side, not out of anger, but out of some fragile, budding strength. She opened her mouth. For a brief moment, no sound came, just the dry scrape of breath against a throat that felt impossibly tight. But then, soft at first, then clearer, her voice emerged. "I never wanted anything more than to do my job," Emily said, her words slightly shaky, but gaining steadiness with each syllable. "I wanted to work. I needed this job, to take care of my family, to help my little brother go to school, to help my mom get her medicine. I never asked for special treatment. I never asked to be seen, but maybe that was the mistake." The room leaned in collectively, drawn not by drama but by the authenticity in her voice. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I stayed small, I could just survive, get through the day, pay the bills. But surviving isn't enough, not anymore." Her gaze, once fixed on the floor, now rose. She looked directly at Gregory. "You told me to go back to the hall. You called me disgraceful, but the only disgraceful thing here is how you've treated people. Not just me, everyone who's ever worked in that kitchen, everyone you thought didn't matter." A wave of hushed, sharp exhales echoed from around the room. Some gasps, some murmured words of support. Lydia Benson nodded slowly, her arms unfolding as though physically releasing whatever tension she had carried. Emily took one step forward. "I'm not ashamed of what I do. I'm not ashamed of washing dishes. I'm not ashamed of working hard, and I won't let anyone—" Her eyes locked on Gregory again, unwavering now. "Make me feel like I should be." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing. Then a single clap, then another. Then a rising tide of applause that surpassed anything that had come before it. This was no longer just an act of solidarity. It was an ovation of recognition, of respect, of something deeper, a collective acknowledgement of a truth that could no longer be denied. Gregory stood paralyzed, jaw slack, his hands trembling visibly now. His eyes, wild and cornered, scanned the room as though hoping someone, anyone, would rescue him from the storm he had conjured. But there was no rescue coming. Not now, not ever. Emily Carter, dishwasher, was no longer invisible. The storm of applause gradually softened, but never fully subsided. It lingered in the air like the echo of a truth that could no longer be ignored, reverberating through every wall, every corner, every person present. Emily stood taller than she ever had in her life. No longer the background figure she had been for so long. Her presence now commanded the entire room, not through force or title, but through the sheer gravity of her dignity. Richard Evans stepped forward again, his sharp gaze settling not on Gregory, who now seemed like little more than a discarded shadow, but entirely on Emily. His posture was different now, less that of a businessman delivering a lesson and more of a mentor about to pass down something precious. "You remind me," Richard began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeply personal. "So much of where I came from. I told you earlier that I started out washing dishes. That was not a metaphor. It was my reality." He paused, scanning the room briefly, ensuring that every word landed exactly where it was meant to. "I was 17. My family had nothing. My mother was ill. My younger sister depended on me. I had two choices, sink or swim. There were days I wanted to give up, to believe the people who told me I was only ever going to be a dishwasher, a line cook, a nobody." His gaze sharpened, locking on Emily with a gentleness that was somehow fiercer than any reprimand he had issued earlier. "But I didn't give up, because I knew that hard work wasn't my weakness. It was my strength." Her murmurs spread through the audience again, but this time they were softer, reflective. Even the most stoic faces among the billionaires showed cracks, some blinking more than usual, others swallowing hard as if remembering parts of their own. Origin stories they had buried beneath years of luxury and success. Richard continued, his voice gaining momentum like a tide pulling everyone in. The first company I built was not glamorous. It was a cleaning service. I started it with $97 I had saved after months of working double shifts. I used to clean office buildings at night, scrubbing floors while teaching myself coding during the day. A few of the guests straightened visibly, clearly having not known this detail about the man whose investments now shaped industries. I failed 3 times, he went on, went bankrupt twice, slept in my car for 6 months. People laughed. People dismissed me. People told me I was out of place whenever I tried to step beyond what they thought was my lane. His eyes flicked briefly toward Gregory, who stood rigid, shrinking more with every syllable. But here's the thing about people who come from the bottom, Richard said, his voice now like steel wrapped in velvet. We learn to fight. We learn to survive. And when we rise, we never forget. He turned back fully to Emily. And we recognize that strength when we see it in others. Emily's throat tightened, and though she struggled to hold back the tears burning behind her eyes, she didn't look away. Something warm, heavy, and humbling filled her chest. For the first time in her life, someone who, the world, considered important, powerful, untouchable, was speaking directly to her, not as an inferior, not as someone invisible, but as an equal. I'm not just telling you this to share my past, Richard said. I'm telling you because I see in you the same resilience that got me through those nights. You have every right to hold your head high. You have every right to demand a respect, and you have every right to dream of something greater. Victoria stepped forward then, her voice adding another layer of weight to the moment. Richard's not the only one with that story, she said, her tone smooth but unyielding. I started out folding shirts in a department store. My family immigrated here with nothing. I used to work 12-hour shifts for minimum wage just to pay for my community college classes. She gestured toward Emily. When I look at you, I don't see a dishwasher. I see someone who understands what it means to work twice as hard for half as much. And let me tell you something, those are the exact qualities that build empires. Another murmur spread through the room. This one was different. It was not merely the polite hum of acknowledgement, it was the sound of shifting perceptions, the foundations cracking beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Emily's hands trembled, but not from fear. This time it was from the overwhelming surge of emotions she could no longer compartmentalize. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but clear. I never imagined anyone would notice me. People like me. We're not supposed to be seen. Richard's smile softened but never lost its firmness. Then it's about time that changes. Samuel Park cleared his throat, his voice carrying a hint of the same steel. The truth is, the people who hold everything together are almost always the least appreciated. The ones wiping the tables, cleaning the floors, washing the dishes. We forget that without them, there's nothing left. No service, no business, no success. His gaze swept the room. And that's a mistake I don't plan to make anymore. More nods, more murmurs. But this time, no one was looking at Gregory for guidance. His power had evaporated. He stood silent, sweating, visibly shrinking, his lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. No one spared him a word of defense. No one so much as glanced at him with sympathy. Richard turned back to Emily. You have 2 choices, Emily. You can walk back into that kitchen, wash those dishes and pretend none of this happened, or you can recognize that this moment isn't just about what was done to you. It's about who you are, about what you're capable of, about where you can go from here. Emily blinked rapidly. I don't know where to start, she whispered, her voice shaking not with weakness, but with the sheer gravity of the moment pressing in on her. Richard nodded slowly. You just did. A quiet settled over the room again, but it was not the suffocating silence from before. It was the electric, breath-holding kind of quiet that comes before something monumental, the kind that whispers that the world, in the very next moment, might tilt on its axis. The heavy silence that settled after Richard's words was not one of confusion or hesitation, but a collective reckoning. The air crackled with a tangible shift, a redistribution of unspoken power. People who minutes ago had entered the cafe to enjoy a luxurious brunch suddenly found themselves unwilling participants in a defining moment. Their roles were no longer passive observers, but conscious contributors to what came next. It began, subtly. A middle-aged man sitting near the window, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit with the insignia of a prominent investment firm embroidered on his cuff, leaned toward his companion. His voice, though low, carried clearly enough in the loaded quiet. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "Absolutely disgraceful behavior from a business owner." His companion nodded sharply. "Never coming here again." A woman seated near the main entrance, who had remained silent until now, abruptly stood. Her heels clicked decisively against the marble floor. She was a well-known fashion executive whose presence was enough to fill magazine columns. With a quick glance toward her assistant, she declared, "Cancel all our future bookings here. Effective immediately." Her assistant, already typing frantically on a tablet, nodded without lifting his gaze. The dominoes fell rapidly. Conversations ignited like sparks over dry leaves. The discomfort and quiet judgment that had festered beneath Gregory's carefully curated image for years finally found a release. The polite facades crumbled, replaced by raw honesty. "I can't believe I spent money supporting this place," someone grumbled from the bar. Another voice rose from the corner. "Competition, but because of leaders like him. This is exactly why small businesses fail. Not because of waiters, who had spent years biting their tongues to avoid Gregory's wrath, now exchanged looks that flickered between disbelief and the cathartic release of long-held resentment. Samuel, the head waiter, no longer bothered to maintain the professional mask. His arms crossed over his chest, his lips pressed in a thin line as he watched the owner disintegrate before the room's eyes. Behind the counter, a barista named Clara set down the milk frother with a loud clang, wiping her hands on her apron. She glanced toward her co-worker Leo and murmured, "I've had enough of this, haven't you?" Leo gave a single, resolute nod, wiping his hands clean and folding his apron without a word. Even the kitchen staff, peering through the order window, abandoned their stations momentarily. The sous chef, a gruff man named Javier, removed his chef's hat and leaned forward on the stainless steel counter, his gaze locked firmly on Gregory, with a glare that communicated years of silent endurance finally tipping into open rebellion. Gregory, who moments ago wielded absolute control, now stood alone in the center of a storm entirely of his own making. His face oscillated between crimson and pale white, the blood rushing and draining in alternating waves of panic and disbelief. His hands trembled as they fumbled to straighten his already perfectly aligned tie, a futile effort to restore an image that had been irreparably shattered. Everyone just calm down," he stammered, attempting to inject authority back into his voice, but it came out brittle and feeble. This is being blown out of proportion." "No," Richard said, his tone cold as winter steel. "This is exactly the proportion it deserves." Gregory's eyes darted to the other wealthy patrons, seeking a lifeline, a single supporter, but none came. Instead, they averted their eyes or stared back with expressions ranging from disappointment to thinly veiled disgust. Then, as though the tension had been building toward a singular, inevitable climax, the first customer stood. Not one of the executives, not a billionaire, but an ordinary middle-aged woman who had been sitting quietly with her husband. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. "We're done here," she said, pulling her coat over her shoulders. "I refuse to give another dollar to a place that treats people like this." Her husband stood wordlessly, following her lead. As they moved toward the door, another table followed. Then another. In less than a minute, a stream of patrons began rising, gathering their coats, their bags, their dignity, and walking out. Some paused just long enough to deliver cutting glances at Gregory. Others snapped quick photos, capturing the scene not for memories but for evidence. Gregory's voice cracked, desperate now. "Stop, stop, you can't all just leave like this." But they could. And they were. At the front counter, Clara untied her apron with shaking hands, slapped it onto the marble surface, and looked Gregory directly in the eyes. "I quit," she said, voice strong despite the tremor in her fingers. "I should have done this years ago." Leo followed suit. "Me too." Samuel, the head waiter, pulled the pen from behind his ear and set it neatly beside the register. "I have never seen a leader embarrass themselves this badly," he said with a shake of his head. "Good luck finding anyone willing to work here after today." Gregory's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mouth moving as if to respond, but no words would form. His throat tightened with the suffocating realization that the empire he had built on fear and intimidation was crumbling, not slowly, not quietly, but in a spectacular public implosion. In the kitchen, Javier folded his arms. The heads of the departing crowd. "I'm done too," he called out, his voice carrying easily over, "I cook, I don't work for tyrants." Even the customers who chose to stay long enough to finish their drinks or pastries did so in rigid silence, their expressions strained, their conversations strained, whispers punctuated with sharp, condemning glances. Gregory's breathing became ragged. He looked once more at Richard as though expecting mercy, but found none. Richard's eyes were implacable, cold, done. "This is what happens," Richard said softly but with devastating clarity. "When you treat people like they are disposable, they remember, they tell others, and they leave, all of them." Victoria stepped forward, her arms crossed. "And so do we." With a glance toward Emily, who stood still, watching this all unfold with the surreal realization that she was no longer the one being judged, Victoria nodded sharply. "Let's go." Richard turned to Emily. "Walk with us." And with that simple invitation, Emily stepped forward. Not as the dishwasher who had been told to return to the shadows, but as someone whose worth had been recognized, whose presence now mattered in a way that transcended the walls of the Golden Spoon. As she walked past Gregory, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She met his gaze for half a second, saw the hollow collapse of a man who had built his world on broken foundations, and then kept walking. The heavy wooden door of the Golden Spoon Cafe swung closed behind Emily, Richard, Victoria, and the growing crowd of people leaving in protest, but the storm it contained did not stay confined within those polished marble walls. As they stepped out onto the busy streets of San Francisco, something far larger than anyone could yet comprehend was already in motion. Dozens of hands still gripped smartphones, thumbs tapping frantically as videos were uploaded, shared, reposted, and commented on in real time. It started with a single post, a short clip, less than 90 seconds, capturing Gregory's voice sharp and venomous, shouting, "Go to the hall, you disgraceful woman," followed by the sudden shift when Richard Evans stood up, began clapping, and the rest of the elite followed. The caption beneath the video was simple but powerful. "Cafe owner humiliates dishwasher. What happens next restores your faith in humanity." Within minutes, the views surged into the tens of thousands. Comments flooded in, first local, then national, then global. Outrage mixed with support, disbelief tangled with solidarity. The internet had found its next story, but this one was more than a passing scandal. It was a symbol, a reckoning. Emily, unaware at first of the wildfire spreading through social media, walked in step with Richard and Victoria, her steps tentative, but strengthening with each block they put between themselves and the cafe. People glanced at them as they passed, some recognizing Richard, a few whispering in surprise at Victoria's presence. But increasingly, they were glancing at Emily too, not with pity, not with condescension, but with curiosity, with interest, with respect. Back inside the cafe, Gregory was only just beginning to realize the full scope of the disaster. As he scrambled behind the counter, desperately refreshing his phone, the notifications were relentless. Mentions of his name exploded across every platform imaginable. Twitter threads dissected his behavior with ruthless precision. TikTok videos spliced his insult alongside Emily's quiet courage and Richard's public call-out, layered with captions like, "This is leadership," and when billionaires have more class than the cafe owner. News outlets were not far behind. A local journalist, having been tagged repeatedly by viewers, showed up at the cafe within an hour, camera rolling, microphone extended. "Mr. Benson, do you have any comment on the allegations of workplace harassment?" she asked as Gregory tried to shove the door closed. "Do you deny calling an employee disgraceful in front of customers?" "No comment," Gregory barked, attempting to pull down the blinds. But it was too late. The damage was no longer his to contain. Outside, Emily's phone buzzed incessantly from her apron pocket. She finally pulled it free, glancing at the screen with growing confusion. Dozens, no hundreds of notifications, messages from numbers she did not recognize, voicemails, friend requests, comments. Her own social media accounts, previously a quiet record of family photos and the occasional sunset, had exploded with followers. "Emily," Victoria said, catching the bewildered look on her face. "Take a deep breath. What is happening?" Emily stammered, staring at her screen. Richard glanced over, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "To the truth, that's all. The world's catching up." As they continued walking, Richard's assistant, an impeccably dressed man named Theo, stepped alongside holding his tablet. "Sir, media inquiries are already pouring in," he reported. "Every major outlet wants a statement. CNBC, CNN, local channels, online platforms. It's escalating." "Faster than expected." Richard nodded. "Of course it is." Theo glanced at Emily. "And they're asking for her, specifically." Emily's eyes widened. "Me?" Victoria placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Yes, you. You are the story now." Meanwhile, the video continued its viral climb. Celebrities began retweeting it. Influencers weighed in with their takes, most expressing outrage at Gregory's behavior and admiration for Emily's grace under fire. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own experiences of being demeaned in service jobs, of being treated as invisible, of being told they didn't belong. "This is every restaurant worker's fantasy," one commenter wrote, "taken down in front of everyone." To finally see the bully boss, her standing there, holding back tears but not backing down, "that's strength," another posted. A prominent labor rights advocate tweeted, "Respect isn't optional. This is why we fight for better worker protections." Even brands chimed in. A popular coffee chain posted, "You deserve better." To all the Emilys out there, thank you. Within hours, the hashtag #SagStandWithEmily was trending globally. Back in the city, Richard led the group into a quiet rooftop lounge, one of his own properties, overlooking the skyline. The space was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding online. Waitstaff here greeted him with genuine smiles, treating Emily with the same deference afforded to any guest, completely unaware that they were serving the woman whose name was now on half the internet. Seated at a glass table, Emily struggled to process everything. She whispered, scrolling through the flood of messages. This doesn't feel real." Richard leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "It is real, and it's a turning point. Not just for you, for everyone who's ever been treated the way you were." Victoria nodded. "What happened today is it struck a nerve, because everyone knows an Emily, everyone's been an Emily at some point, and they're tired of being invisible." Theo approached again, phone in hand. "Tonight, they're offering a primetime spot. Emily, CNN wants to know if you'll do a live interview." Emily blinked. "Me? On TV?" Richard smiled. "It ever has. Only if you want to. But you should know. Your voice matters now." More than as she sat there staring out at the skyline, Emily realized something profound. The humiliation Gregory tried to force upon her had backfired spectacularly. What was meant to diminish her had instead revealed something indestructible. Not just in her, but in every person who had ever been told they were less. She was no longer just a dishwasher. She was a voice, and the world was listening. By the time the morning had shifted fully into midday, The quiet rooftop lounge where Emily sat transformed from a peaceful refuge into a command center buzzing with movement. Phones rang without pause. Screens flashed with non-stop updates. Theo moved between conversations with the ease of someone accustomed to orchestrating chaos. Richard and Victoria remained calm, composed, almost methodical in their handling of the escalating media frenzy. But for Emily, the world had tilted so violently off its axis that she could barely breathe. It started with the first news van that pulled up outside the Golden Spoon Cafe. Cameras swung out, microphones extended, reporters speaking in quick, animated bursts as they relayed the breaking story. Local affiliates were the first on the scene, but within an hour the national networks followed. Anchors who had never set foot on this street now stood in front of the cafe's elegant signage, speaking urgently into lenses as if a political scandal had just unfolded. Gregory, who had retreated into the back office in a desperate attempt to escape the flood, found himself trapped. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from investors demanding explanations, from suppliers threatening to cancel contracts, and from legal advisors urging him to shut his mouth before things worsened. But even if he wanted to disappear, it was already too late. His name, his face, his words, they were everywhere. Down on the sidewalk, reporters jostled for space. Microphones crowded toward any employee willing to talk. Clara, the former barista who had quit mid-shift, gave a raw, impromptu interview, her voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and relief. "I worked there for 4 years," she said, her hands gripping the microphone with white knuckles. "We've been treated like garbage that entire time. Nobody ever said anything because we were scared, because we needed the job. But Emily," she stood up, "and now we're not scared anymore." Footage of her interview spread instantly. Clips were sliced, edited, captioned, and shared across every platform imaginable. Hashtags proliferated: Shiu boycott Golden Spoon, Shiu justice for Emily, Shiu dignity at work. TikTok influencers filmed reactions, live-streamed commentary, and even filmed themselves, cancelling reservations. Journalists quickly began to dig deeper. A local investigative team published a thread within an hour revealing Gregory's history of labor violations previously settled quietly out of court. Former employees came forward. Anonymous sources leaked emails, screenshots of text messages, and recordings that painted a picture of a man whose cruelty was not a bad day, but a habit. Inside the lounge, Emily sat frozen, watching the chaos unfold on a tablet Theo had placed in front of her. Footage of the cafe's entrance was interspersed with clips of her face, zoomed-in shots of the moment she stood before Gregory, juxtaposed with the billionaire applause that followed. Headlines screamed across the screen: "Dishwasher humiliated by cafe owner. Billionaires applaud her instead." Her stomach twisted in knots. "I don't know how to... What am I supposed to say to all these people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not need to perform," Victoria said calmly, leaning in. "You only need to be honest. That's what got you here. That's what the world responded to. People don't want a speech. They want the truth." Theo's phone vibrated again. He glanced at it, then looked up. "CNN is offering a primetime slot. MSNBC wants her live in the next 30 minutes. Fox wants a statement. BuzzFeed, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're all calling." Emily stared at him, her pulse hammering in her ears. More than 3 people. I've never even spoken in front of... "You stood up to Gregory in front of an entire room of billionaires," Richard said quietly. "Think a few cameras are scarier than that." "You," Emily exhaled, her fingers gripping the armrest. Her heart said no. Her fear screamed no. But something deeper, a quiet voice that had survived every hardship life had ever thrown her way, whispered yes. As the press flooded the streets, some reporters shifted focus. Realizing Emily was no longer at the cafe, they began speculating about her whereabouts. News helicopters hovered overhead, capturing live footage of the crowd gathering, protest signs appearing almost spontaneously. People who had never met her stood on the sidewalk holding cardboard that read, "We stand with Emily and workers deserve respect." Meanwhile, social media became a battleground. Some commentators debated labor rights. Others dissected the power dynamics between service workers and customers. But overwhelmingly, the consensus was clear. Emily was a symbol now. A mirror held up to every restaurant, every office, every workplace where invisible labor was treated as disposable. Gregory tried briefly to issue a statement through his lawyer, a cold, lifeless apology, blaming miscommunication and stressful circumstances. The internet was merciless. Screenshots of the statement were ratioed instantly. The comments section exploded with rejection, disbelief, and anger. "This isn't stress. This is who you are," one reply read. Another went viral simply saying, "Nah, we saw the video." Inside the lounge, Theo handed Emily a bottled water and said downstairs, "There's a press room set up." "They're ready for you, a press room?" she echoed, her voice distant. Richard nodded. "It's just a room, same as any other, people asking questions. You've answered harder ones in your life." Emily stood slowly. Her knees wobbled but didn't buckle. She walked to the window, looking down at the growing crowd below. Dozens, no, hundreds of people with cameras, microphones, and homemade signs. Her image was already being broadcast. On the giant screens across the square, her face blown up 10 feet tall, paired with a caption that simply read, "The dishwasher who refused to be invisible." Her palms were damp, her mouth was dry, but she turned, squared her shoulders and said, "Let's go." As she stepped into the elevator, the numbers blinked down, 10, 9, 8. Each tick tightened the coil in her chest. When the doors opened, the noise hit her like a wave. Flashes of cameras, the hum of voices, reporters calling her name. For a split second, her instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, to vanish, but instead, she stepped forward. The noise grew louder. Dozens of reporters surged toward her, microphones extended. Flashes burst like fireworks. "Emily, how do you feel about what happened? Do you have anything to say to Gregory? What's next for you?" She glanced toward Richard and Victoria, who stood slightly behind her, nodding, offering silent reassurance. Then she stepped up to the podium, fingers gripping the sides. Her breath shook, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "My name is Emily Carter," she began, "and I have something to say." The words hung in the air longer than Emily expected. A silence deeper than the hum of cameras or the murmur of reporters filled the space as her opening statement settled. It was not the uncomfortable silence of hesitation, but the stillness of a room waiting to bear witness to something raw and real. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Emily continued, her voice trembling only slightly. "I never imagined anyone would care what someone like me has to say. I've washed dishes for years. I've stood behind doors while people talked in front of me like I wasn't there. I've spent my life believing that if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet, maybe things would get better. Maybe someone would notice. But nobody ever did." She paused, scanning the sea of cameras and expectant faces. Some reporters nodded in encouragement. Others scribbled furiously, capturing every word. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't plan it. I never wanted to be anyone's story. But what happened to me? It's not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. About every worker who's been treated like they're invisible." The applause that erupted was not the explosive, theatrical kind, but the slow rising sound of people who knew they were hearing something important, real, undeniable. As the press conference continued, questions came in waves, some respectful, others invasive, but Emily navigated them with a mixture of honesty and humility that won over even the most skeptical reporters. She admitted she was overwhelmed. She admitted she had no idea what came next. But each answer carried a quiet strength that resonated far beyond the walls of that room. When the conference finally ended, the buzz didn't die. If anything, it grew. Footage of her speech looped across every major news network. Clips flooded social media, with captions declaring her the voice of a generation tired of being unseen. Back upstairs in the lounge, Emily collapsed into a chair, exhausted. Her hands trembled, her heartbeat still thundered against her ribs, but there was something else too, an unfamiliar sense of pride, of having done something terrifying and survived it. Richard sat across from her, watching with a thoughtful expression. Victoria stood by the window, arms crossed, her gaze distant as if calculating 10 steps ahead. Theo approached, his tablet in hand, and cleared his throat. "There's something you need to see." He flipped the screen toward Emily. On it was an email, an official letterhead from the California Business and Innovation Scholarship Foundation. The subject line read, "Full scholarship offer for Emily Carter." Her eyes widened. "A scholarship?" Theo nodded, smiling. "Full ride. Any accredited business school in California. They watched the conference, they were moved, and they're offering you a chance." Emily's mouth opened, but no words came. Her mind raced. Years of putting her own dreams aside to take care of her family. Years of believing college was a luxury for other people, not for someone like her. And now it was being offered to her freely. But Theo wasn't finished. He tapped to the next notification. "There's more." On the screen was another message, this one from Evans Global Ventures, Richard's own company. "Offer of internship and mentorship, Evans Global Ventures." Emily blinked, staring in disbelief. "An internship?" Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Not just an internship," he said, his tone softer now, more personal. "A paid mentorship. You'll work alongside some of the brightest people in the business. You'll learn everything: finance, operations, leadership. If you accept, you'll never be anyone's invisible worker again." Her throat tightened. I don't even know where to start." Richard smiled. "That's the best part. You do not need to know everything right now. We'll teach you. You've already shown more resilience and integrity than most people ever do." Victoria stepped closer, her voice warm but direct. "And when you graduate, if you want, we'll help you open your own cafe the right way. A place where no one will ever be treated the way you were." Emily's breath caught in her chest. Her fingers dug into the chair's armrest, trying to ground herself against the tidal wave of emotion. This is real." "As real as it gets," Richard said. "You earned this, Emily. Not because of the cameras. Not because of what happened today, but because of who you've always been." Tears finally breached the barrier she had held firm for hours. They slid silently down her cheeks as she laughed, a shaky, incredulous sound. I never thought." "You don't have to think it anymore," Victoria said, sitting beside her. "You just have to believe it." Emily wiped her face, nodding, unable to form coherent words. Her mind darted instantly to her family. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything to keep them afloat despite her illness. Her brother Noah, who still believed his big sister was a superhero even when she came home exhausted and broken. As if reading her mind, Richard added, "And there's one more thing. A trust fund. We've already spoken to a legal team. A sum to cover your mother's medical care and your brother's education, fully funded, no strings." Emily gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. This is too much." No, I can't. It's not charity," Richard said gently. "It's an investment in you because you are worth it." Theo stepped back slightly, giving her space as she sat, hands pressed against her face, trying to process a reality so drastically different from the one she'd woken up to that morning. The door buzzed again. More reporters waiting. More requests. More messages of support from strangers all over the world. But in that room, for that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time in her life, Emily Carter wasn't thinking about surviving the day. She was thinking about the future. A future that for the first time was entirely hers. While Emily's life began to shift into an entirely new orbit, the collapse of Gregory Benson's carefully constructed world accelerated with ruthless speed. The footage of his public humiliation was no longer just viral. It had been dissected by commentators, meme creators, labor rights activists, and journalists. Every frame had been analyzed, shared, replayed, and captioned with statements that left no ambiguity about public sentiment. The court of public opinion had convened, and its verdict was unforgiving. By the following morning, the Golden Spoon Cafe was unrecognizable. Where once stood a line of expensive cars and polished customers, now gathered a wall of protesters. Cardboard signs reading "Respect Workers" and "Boycott Benson" swayed in the breeze, their handwritten letters loud in their simplicity. News vans clogged the street. Police cruisers were stationed nearby, not for threats of violence, but simply to maintain order amidst the overwhelming media presence. A giant vinyl banner was draped over the cafe's entrance, put there overnight by protesters. In bold black paint it read, "This place humiliates workers." Images of Gregory's face, frozen in that moment of his screaming insult, were plastered onto flyers handed out to anyone passing by. Inside the cafe, the scene was even more dire. The staff had walked out completely. Not one barista, not one waiter, not one dishwasher remained. Tables sat unbussed. Counters were littered with half-finished drinks from customers who had left. Mid-scandal? The kitchen was cold. The air, once filled with the scent of fresh espresso and baked goods, now reeked of abandonment and dust settling over a failed empire. Gregory sat in his office, the door locked, blinds drawn, his phone vibrating so constantly that he finally powered it off just to silence the relentless stream of notifications. But shutting off the device did not shut off the reality outside. Lawsuits began landing within hours. Several former employees, emboldened by Emily's public stand and the overwhelming show of support, filed claims for workplace harassment, unpaid overtime, and wrongful termination. One after another, their lawyers contacted the press, detailing patterns of verbal abuse, impossible demands, and threats that had previously remained hidden in the shadows of fear. The cafe's online presence disintegrated. Review sites that once boasted glowing praise now brimmed with scathing one-star reviews. "Avoid this place like the plague," one read. "Supporting them is supporting abuse." Another simply posted, "I hope every employer like Gregory watches this and realizes their time is up." Worse still, corporate partners began pulling out. Suppliers refused deliveries. The artisanal coffee roaster that had once proudly advertised their partnership with the Golden Spoon issued a public statement condemning Gregory's behavior, announcing the immediate termination of all contracts. Local government officials, eager to align themselves with public sentiment, released statements about investigating the cafe for labor violations. Health inspectors showed up not for a routine check but for a surprise audit. Rumors swirled that fines were imminent, not for cleanliness, but for a slew of overlooked safety violations suddenly brought to light by ex-employees speaking out. Gregory's lawyer arrived, stepping over picket lines and squeezing through throngs of reporters. "This is salvageable," he lied, folding himself into the office chair. "We can issue an apology, maybe a donation to a labor rights charity. Spin this as a misunderstanding." Gregory, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, shook his head violently. "Won't believe that. They've seen the video. They've seen everything." No, they've seen worse scandals," the lawyer insisted, but the desperation in his voice betrayed his own disbelief. "Oh, you do not get it," Gregory spat, slamming his fist onto the desk. "It's personal. They love her. They hate me. This isn't just a scandal. This..." The lawyer's phone buzzed. He glanced down, paled, then looked back at Gregory. "It just got worse." "What?" Gregory rasped. "Your investors. They're out. All of them. You're no longer liquid." Gregory's breath hitched. His hands gripped the desk edge so hard his knuckles whitened. "They can't. They wouldn't." "No. They would," the lawyer corrected grimly. And they did. Within hours, the building's landlord issued a notice of intent to terminate the lease. Gregory's business bank accounts were frozen, pending review of multiple claims of wage theft now surfacing. Local labor rights organizations joined the protests, calling for permanent closure and legal consequences beyond mere financial penalties. The worst blow, however, arrived via a simple email forwarded from his personal assistant, a resignation letter from the cafe's general manager, citing moral objections to Gregory's behavior. Attached was a spreadsheet containing the names of every employee who had ever worked there, annotated with detailed reports of abuses, ignored complaints and unethical practices Gregory had believed would stay buried. By noon, a live feed broadcast Gregory himself, red-faced and sweating, attempting to speak to reporters gathered outside. His voice cracked as he stammered through a hastily prepared statement. There has been a gross misunderstanding. he began, but the crowd booed so loudly that his words were drowned out. "Say her name," someone shouted. "Apologize to Emily." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin, miserable line. He opened his mouth, closed it, then muttered something incomprehensible before retreating back inside, chased by jeers and flashing cameras. In the background, someone projected the now famous video onto the side of the building. The looping image of Gregory shouting, "Go to the hall, you disgraceful woman," played over and over, followed by the moment Richard Evans stood up and started clapping for Emily. Each loop was a fresh humiliation, a public reminder that the entire world was watching. Inside his office, Gregory stared at the projection visible, even through the blinds. His reflection in the window merged with the towering image of himself mid-rage. He looked at it, this monstrous version of himself, and for the first time, there was no anger left, only something colder, heavier. A hollow recognition that his empire had not just crumbled, it had been exposed for what it always was. Not a kingdom, not a success. Just a gilded cage built on the backs of the very people he had spent his life pretending did not matter. Weeks rolled forward with a momentum that felt unstoppable, sweeping Emily Carter into a new reality that seemed impossibly distant from the life she had known just days before. What began as a humiliating moment in a cafe had transformed into something far larger, not only for her but for every person who had ever worked quietly, diligently and invisibly behind the scenes. The media frenzy that followed the viral video showed no sign of slowing down. Talk shows requested her presence. Articles dissected her story in multiple languages. Labor rights groups invited her to speak at rallies. Universities requested that she share her experience with students studying business ethics. Yet amid all of the attention, the chaos, the sudden public recognition, Emily never once allowed herself to lose sight of where she had come from or what this moment truly represented. On a crisp, sunny morning in early spring, Emily stood on the stage of the California Young Leaders Conference. Before her sat an audience of over 2,000 people, students, professionals, business leaders, and activists, all gathered to honor recipients of the Rising Voices Award, given to individuals who had demonstrated exceptional courage and leadership in the face of adversity. As the event host introduced her, the crowd rose in applause that was louder, longer, and more sincere than anything she had ever heard. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, but none of it felt overwhelming this time. This was no longer a moment happening to her. This was a moment she had created. Emily stepped forward, her posture steady, her head high. She wore a simple yet elegant navy blue suit, a gift from Victoria, tailored perfectly. Her hair was styled softly around her face, and for the first time she wore a small pin on her lapel, engraved with the words, "Dignity is power." When the applause finally softened, she began. "A few months ago, I was just someone washing dishes," she said, her voice clear, steady. "Someone no one noticed, someone no one thought had anything important to say. I believed that if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet, maybe life would get better. But I've learned that silence is not the same as dignity, and sometimes to claim your dignity you have to stop being silent." The audience hung on every word. "I didn't choose for my story to go viral. I didn't want to become a headline. But I've realized something since then. This was never just about me. This was about every worker who has ever been told that their labor, their presence, their existence was unimportant." She paused, scanning the crowd. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Dignity doesn't come from your job title. It doesn't come from how much money you make or how many people know your name. It comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take that from you." Applause roared again, echoing against the high ceilings. As she continued, Emily shared her plans, how she had accepted the full scholarship to the University of California School of Business, how she had started her internship at Evans Global Ventures, and how she was learning to build something of her own. "I'm working on opening a cafe," she announced, and the crowd cheered wildly. "But it won't be like the one I came from. It will be a place where every worker is seen, valued, and respected, where no one ever has to wonder if they matter, because they do." The applause didn't stop this time. It rose to a standing ovation, wave after wave of clapping and cheering that left her breathless but smiling, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with joy. After the ceremony, reporters gathered around her, but the questions were no longer invasive or prying. They were respectful. They asked about her vision for her cafe. They asked how her mother was doing, how her brother was adjusting to this whirlwind change. Emily answered each one with a grace that surprised even herself. Her mother, now receiving full medical care thanks to the trust fund set up by Richard and Victoria, was recovering steadily, her spirits lifted for the first time in years. Noah had started high school with a newfound confidence, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his sister was the coolest person on earth. Richard and Victoria stood nearby, watching as Emily navigated this new chapter of her life. Pride glimmered in their eyes, not the patronizing pride of someone taking credit, but the genuine quiet pride of mentors who had simply opened a door and watched someone walk boldly through it. Later that evening, Emily stood before a sleek, glass storefront on a busy street corner. The lease was signed, the renovation plans were underway. Her dream was no longer a scribble in an old notebook, but a blueprint, a schedule, a reality. The sign above the door read simply, "The Open Table." Below it, in smaller script, were the words, "Where everyone belongs." Inside, workers bustled about setting up counters, testing equipment and painting walls. But they were not just employees, they were future partners. Every single person would share in the profits, have a voice in how the business operated, and be treated with the respect that had once been denied to Emily. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard read, "Proud of you. You've built something more than a cafe. You've built a movement." Emily looked around, feeling the weight and beauty of the moment. Her life was no longer confined to the back room of someone else's success. She was at the front, steering her own ship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the storefront in gold, Emily turned the key in the lock, opened the door, and stepped inside. Not as a dishwasher, not as someone invisible, but as the owner, as the leader, as someone who had transformed her greatest humiliation into her greatest triumph. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, by the smell of fresh paint and the buzz of possibility, Emily Carter knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.